Support for Tech Stuff comes from our friends at Rocket Mortgage by Quicken Loans. Chances are you're confident when it comes to your work, your hobbies, and your life. Rocket Mortgage gives you that same level of confidence when it comes to buying a home or refinancing your existing home loan. With Rocket Mortgage, you can apply simply and understand fully so you can mortgage confidently. To get started, go to rocketmortgage.com/techstuff. Equal housing lender, licensed in all 50 states. NMLS consumeraccess.org number 3030.
Get in touch with technology with TechStuff from HowStuffWorks.com.
Hey everybody, it's Jonathan Strickland here with Tech Stuff Classic Episodes. We're doing some Saturday morning reruns for you guys. This is a special series where we're going to dig up some classic episodes of Tech Stuff and present them to you guys who may not have had a chance to listen to them, especially if you're a brand new listener. First of all, welcome if that's the case. I hope you enjoy these episodes. This one is called The Dirt on Digital Audio, and it is an episode all about the actual technical process of recording audio into a digital format and what that requires, because it's very different from the analog style. I hope you guys enjoy it. This episode was originally published on November 23rd, 2016, and just in case you're listening to this one in the far future, I'm recording this in 2018. So we're going to time travel a bit and listen to this classic episode, The Dirt on Digital Audio. So to start it all off, we all have to take a quick trip to Germany. So anyone who is not in Germany, get your passport. I was actually in Germany not that long ago. I got to visit Berlin and had a wonderful time. And in Germany, there's a company called Fraunhofer Gesellschaft. And you might wonder, well, what does this company do? They think. I joke that my profession, that my title that I should put on my business card, it should say professional smart person. Well, no joke. That's what these people are. They specialize in research and development, applied research. It's a whole company that specializes in applied research, and it's huge. It encompasses 67 institutes and research units across Germany. Well, back in the 80s, there was a researcher named Karl-Heinz Brandenburg. And Karl-Heinz made a breakthrough around 1986, 1987, and came up with this clever idea about encoding audio. He was actually working toward creating a way that would allow for high audio quality transfer, but having a low bit rate sampling so that file sizes and transfer times wouldn't get out of control. Because you got to remember, this is the 80s. This is before the World Wide Web was a thing. That wouldn't happen until the early 90s. So the internet was very young. In fact, they weren't even looking at the internet as a method of distribution for this particular type of encoded audio. They were looking at using this to transmit across telephone lines. So they needed to have something that was going to be high quality but low space. So what the heck does that mean? All right, well, digital audio and analog audio are very different things. So to understand that, we need to look at how sound works and how we describe sound, because that informs how we can capture sound and replicate those qualities digitally. So stick with me. We're going to go back to school for some basic sound science. And this goes back to the way sound physically moves through a medium, whether that's a solid or through the air or through water. Sound is vibration. Now, we sense this primarily through hearing it, or sometimes feeling it. If it's the right frequency and the right amplitude, we can actually feel sound. Anyone who stood close to, say, a subwoofer that was really blasting out bass notes, you know what I'm talking about. You can feel it pressing against you. Well, sound travels through the air when molecules vibrate against each other. And this creates instances of increased pressure and decreased pressure at what is a hyper-local level. We're not talking about weather maps here. We're talking about tiny little areas. So this increase and decrease in pressure is something that we can sense as sound. When those changes in pressure affect a diaphragm, such as one that's in a microphone, or maybe your eardrum, for example, it causes the diaphragm to actually move. So increased pressure pushes the diaphragm in, and decreased pressure doesn't really pull the diaphragm out. I mean, you could say it pulls the diaphragm out, but to be more accurate, the diaphragm actually pushes outward because the pressure on the outside is lower than the pressure on the inside. But you get what I'm saying. The diaphragm begins to flex inward and outward depending upon the amount of pressure that it's encountering. You could imagine this being kind of like a drum, not an eardrum, but an actual drum, and striking it. That's the same sort of thing. So sound is the fluctuations of pressure, which we can diagram as a wave or a wavelength, a waveform on an XY axis. So the horizontal line, that axis, that represents time that has passed. And the vertical axis represents the amplitude or the volume of the sound wave. The wavelength of the sound, which is the distance between successive points on a wave, such as like the successive crests on a wave, that tells you a lot about the frequency. So sound moves at a constant rate through a given medium, but it moves at different rates through different media. So in other words, it moves at a different speed through a solid than it does through air. If the crests of each sound wave are really close together, that's a high frequency sound. More waves will pass through an arbitrary point within a second than waves that are spaced further apart. That would be a lower frequency sound. Higher frequency sounds have a higher pitch than lower frequency sounds. So if you hold a single note at a constant frequency, you'll have what is called a simple harmonic motion. That means the vibrations are moving at a constant rate, inward and outward. The cycle is constant. A tuning fork is a good example of this. So if you hear a clear C note played on a musical instrument, that could be a simple harmonic motion. It won't be, but it could be. I'll tell you why it won't be in a minute. So the frequency of vibration doesn't change, and so you would get this very clear note as a result. And if you were to diagram it, you would have very regular crests and troughs, all of the same amplitude and distance from each other. The frequency and volume would remain constant. Assuming, of course, that you're not trying to change the frequency or volume. Now, this is where I point out most musical instruments don't produce a single clear note, even if played expertly. They actually create several resonant frequencies. So every physical object resonates at several different frequencies. You've probably seen this in various programs. Mythbusters did one about bridges. The idea being that if you were to have a group of people marching on a bridge at the bridge's resonant frequency, it could cause the bridge to start to vibrate and swing out of control. Well, there's a reason for this. You may have also seen videos of people singing a certain note and causing a crystal glass to shatter. That's because that crystal glass does have a resonant frequency, and if you can hit that resonant frequency at the right volume, you can cause the glass to start to deform, or the crystal in this case, to deform to a point where it loses integrity and it shatters as a result. Well, the resonation of an object is dependent upon lots of different factors, and in fact, most stuff will resonate at different frequencies, but at different intensities. Like there might be one sweet spot, one specific frequency that will have the greatest effect. But other related frequencies may also have an effect. It'll just be to a lesser extent. Well, if you were to pluck a guitar string, just you've tuned it to whatever note, doesn't matter. Let's say you've tuned it to G, and you play the G string on your guitar. The note that you will hear really over all others will be G. That is going to be the one that will sound the loudest, but it will also play resonant frequencies at a decreased amplitude. In other words, a decreased volume. So you still hear the intended note above everything else, above all the other resonant frequencies. This is called a complex tone. And that collection of frequencies and their amplitudes is called the spectrum of sound. You get a full spectrum. Now, some of the components of that complex tone will be imperceptible to you. They'll be so quiet that you wouldn't really notice them. They might affect the overall quality of the sound, but in such a subtle way that it may be difficult for you to even put it into words. Each of those little components is called a partial. So in the example of a guitar string, the partials are all integers of the same fundamental frequency, and the sound has a harmonic spectrum. But as you get further away from that fundamental frequency, the amplitude decreases significantly. So like I said, you get far enough away, they are technically there, but they might be imperceptible to you. Now, some sounds have frequencies that aren't integers of a fundamental frequency and are inharmonic. Certain bells, like if you hear a bell ring, you can probably pick out a couple of different frequencies there that are not harmonic frequencies. These are very complex sounds, and to our perception, if it's complex enough, it can seem like there's no single discernible pitch there, like there's no fundamental frequency over all the others. If it's complex enough, we call it noise. That is the technical term. It is noise. Now, the unit we use to measure frequency is the hertz. Hertz. Typical human hearing ranges from 20 hertz, which means a wave will pass a given arbitrary point 20 times within a second, all the way up to 20 kilohertz, which means a wave will pass a particular point in time 20,000 times in a second, or a particular point on your waveform 20,000 times in a second. And most of our sensitivity tends to be between 1 or 2 kilohertz up to 4 or 5 kilohertz. That's generally where we have human voices, and we've really gotten good at picking those out of over everything else. So our sensitivity of hearing is really concentrated between 1 kilohertz and 4 kilohertz, or 2 and 5, depending upon whom you ask. Now we get back over to amplitude. That is referring to the height of the wave. It also refers to the volume, the loudness of something. Amplitude means bigness. So how big is the sound? Well, the greater the amplitude, the louder it is. And amplitudes can have an enormous range and affect how we perceive sound. So, for example, take a really complicated classical piece of music. It's just easy to explain it in that term. You might have a stretch in that classical piece of music in which all the instruments are more or less playing at a similar volume. So the sound from each instrument section has a similar amplitude. But then there might be one segment where an instrument group, or maybe even a single soloist, has an increased amplitude, an increased volume. It rises over the rest of the orchestra. And that peak of the amplitude is called the attack of the sound. And the entire range of amplitudes is called the amplitude envelope. Now, this is important when we get to MP3s, because the way we perceive these sounds, that has everything to do with the way the MP3 was designed. The whole point of the MP3 was to try and create a small file size to represent what we can hear and kind of ignore everything else. But we'll get to that in a little bit more time. So this is really interesting to me. If you take a sound and you double its amplitude, you increase the amplitude by twofold, a listener would not necessarily feel that the sound is twice as loud. Human hearing is incredibly subjective, and typically, for most listeners, it would require much more than doubling a sound's amplitude for them to feel that the sound itself was twice as loud. This perception of volume is important when we get to the lossy formats for audio files. Now, I've given you all this information, and I know everyone is probably thinking, I learned this in primary school, elementary school. All of this is really familiar to me, and you're maybe rolling your eyes because it's so basic. But I think it's important to have that refresher so that you can understand the difference between sound as we experience it and sound as the way we encode it digitally and replicate it digitally. For one thing, this illustrates how sound in the real world is a continuum. It's a continuum both in frequency and amplitude. You can have sound changing in frequency very smoothly from one pitch to another. You can also have sound increase or decrease in amplitude in a very smooth way. And it is continuous. It's unbroken. It can have smooth transitions, and these qualities provide challenges when we want to describe something digitally because at the heart of digital information is the bit, the basic unit of information. It is a unit of information that only has two states, 0 or 1. It's essentially off or on. When you get down to defining information in just two states, then you start to look at something that is continuous and you realize, this is going to be a challenge. How do I describe a continuous experience in very discrete amounts of information? And that's when we get to the methodology we've developed to digitally encode sound. Now, I'm going to get into that in just a minute, but before I do that, let's take a quick break to thank our sponsor. 16 million new-collar jobs will be created by 2024. To help fill them, IBM's new education model gives high school students workplace experience and an associate's degree. 90 P-Tech schools are already preparing graduates for tomorrow's STEM careers. Let's put smart to work. Find out how at ibm.com/ptech. All right, let's get back into it. So we've talked about the nature of sound. Analog sound, by the way, tries to replicate exactly what we would experience in nature. It tries to create this continuous experience. So you get these smooth waves of frequencies and amplitudes, and that's why some people argue that analog styles of sound recordings are superior to digital ones. I don't necessarily think they're right, but they often feel that way. So something like a vinyl album, which is an analog format of an analog format of music storage, I should say, sound storage. They think that is superior to, say, a CD, which is a digital storage format. And who's to say? I mean, like, if your sense of hearing is incredibly well tuned, you might be able to pick up on some differences. Or if someone did a really terrible job encoding music digitally, then that might reveal itself to you as well. But this is one of those things that I think a lot of people feel they can tell the difference, but if they were to do a double blind test, they might be surprised at how difficult it is. If everything's working the way it should, then there shouldn't be a perceptible difference. At any rate, digital audio has two really important factors: sample rate and bit depth, or to another extent, bit rate. We'll talk about bit rate as well. So the sample rate refers to how many times you reference an analog sound to create the digital version. So sound, like I said, is uninterrupted in the analog world. You've got that nice wave form in the analog world. That's not how digital world works. Digital world, we have to describe that sound in a series of discrete snippets of sound. It's probably easiest to describe this with an analogy to movies on film. If you work with film, like you're creating a movie on film, then you know that you're not looking at a real moving picture when you see the film played out at the cinema. Instead, what you're looking at is a series of photographs. If you take a film strip and you look at it under a light, you'll see it's one after another photograph. It's just a series of pictures. It's only when you play them back at the right speed and you project it onto a screen that you get the illusion of continuous motion. But it's not really continuous. It's just this series of photographs played at 24 frames per second in the case of actual film. So that ends up being very analogous to the way we encode digital audio. You take the analog recording and you take snapshots of sound. The more frequently you take those snapshots, the higher your sample rate. So in other words, if you did 1 a second, your sample rate would be awful. You would have a sample rate of 1. But the higher the sample rate, the closer your digital representation will be to the frequency in the analog sound format. Actually, what's really important to remember is that your sample rate has to be about twice, actually does have to be twice what the highest frequency sound is in your recording. It has to be, because if it's not, it cannot encode that sound accurately. It's kind of interesting. And you might wonder, how do we take these snapshots in the first place? Well, if you're capturing audio, let's say we're recording to digital. So we've got a microphone set up and we're recording to a digital media storage. Like, let's just say we're recording straight to someone's hard drive. So we're talking into a microphone, recording to a hard drive. So you're using an analog microphone, let's say. You would need an analog to digital converter. Now, this particular component can receive discrete voltages from another device, like your microphone. So your microphone is converting sound into differences in voltage. That's essentially how it communicates, so that it can then send that to some other element. In this case, it's sending it to the analog to digital converter so that it can be stored digitally on your hard drive. So this analog digital converter references or samples the discrete voltage many times every second in order to create a digital representation of the analog sound. It converts the voltages into numbers in a process called quantization. And we express those numbers in bits. So these are zeros and ones. When you want to play the digital audio, a digital to analog converter does the same process in reverse. So it takes this digital information, these zeros and ones, and converts it into a series of discrete voltages, which then can be amplified and sent to a speaker and create sound. So all of that's really important, but now let's talk about some concrete examples. And the best way to do this is to go with compact discs, because we have a standard sample rate for compact discs, and that standard sample rate is 44.1 kilohertz to create CD quality audio. That means that the audio is sampled 44,100 times every second. But wait, I hear you say the range of human hearing, you said, only goes to 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. If it only goes up to 20 kilohertz, why are you sampling it 44,100 times every second? If it's 20,000 times a second for the